All right. So before we get into the book that we're going to look at tonight, I want you just to think, because this is the 16th book of the Bible that we've been in, that we've looked at in 4 months. And, you know, it's easy to think that the Bible records a lot of negativity, doesn't it? I mean, if you think back to, you know, even the very beginning, you know, Adam and Eve sinned, and then all the consequences of their sin, and in the very next generation, one brother murders another brother. You get to the book of Exodus, and God blesses his people, but then they reject him, they rebel against him, and they worship idols. And then it seems like from there on, they just do nothing but complain and complain and complain. God gives them so much and gives them food and is providing for them, but they just complain and complain. And then even Moses disobeys God and is not able to go into the promised land. And then the book of Judges, it's like everybody is just lost spiritually. It doesn't seem like there's any good. There are more bad examples in the book of Judges than there are good examples. There's not really any good examples in the book of Judges. Then you get to the book of Samuel, and the people ask for a king, and then Saul was a failure. I mean, he didn't honor God. He didn't obey God. David was a little bit better, but David made a lot of mistakes too. And so there's a lot of negative stuff in the Bible. That doesn't mean that the Bible focuses just on the negative. I don't want us to ever read the Bible and just seem constantly negative. Just in the books that we've looked at, I mean, you have Ruth, which is a beautiful story of obedience and honoring God, and a love story. You have God blessing his people, making this covenant with Abraham and with Moses and with David. The Psalms are a book of worship, and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So it's not like the Bible focuses on negative. But why do you think that there is so much negative in the Bible? I mean, why wouldn't God just sort of leave out all those parts and focus more on the positive things? Why does the Bible record so much negativity and just evil and bad examples? Why would that be in the Bible?
It doesn't show the real story of humanity. There's not really any bad parts.
Okay, all right. So the Bible's honest about humanity. That sometimes we do make good choices, but we do make bad choices too. And so we shouldn't think of Moses or Abraham or Ruth or David or anybody as just perfect and never sinned. God wants us to see the bad too. Why else do you think that it just seems like there's so much negative, and thou shalt not, and this person's evil, and it just seems like there's so much of that in the Bible? Why else do you, other than that's the picture of humanity, why else do you think the Bible would have so much negativity in it?
To be like an instruction for us.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of to show the consequences restraining from God.
Yeah. Okay.
To me, it's an encouragement. I mean, when you look at the fact that, like David is called a man after God's own heart, and yet you see all his failures, it's kind of a consolation that my failures don't define me.
Yeah.
I mean, not that they encourage me by any means, but when I focus on the things that I don't do that I should do, and vice versa, it's comforting to know that I'm still a Christian, that God still loves me, that he's still working in my life when I can see all those examples in the Bible.
Yeah. So I bring that up because the book that we're going to look at tonight is, and we're not going to have time just to look at every single thing, but it's very negative. The book of 2 Kings. It just seems like almost all negative. One king, this guy is evil, and then he gets replaced by another guy who is evil, and then every once in a while you'll see a king who did try to do good and did please God, but for the most part it can be a little bit discouraging to read through 2 Kings because it can seem like either God doesn't notice people who are trying to do the right thing, or he notices but it doesn't matter, because whether you do the right thing or whether you do the wrong thing, everybody still seems to suffer. Like, for instance, in Israel and Judah both. Some people tried to please God, some people didn't try to please God, but both nations got conquered and taken into exile. So it can be a little bit discouraging to see all this and it might make you think that it doesn't matter much whether you try to live for God and you try to do the right thing or you don't really care, because it seems like both people suffer the same consequences. And so the book of 2 Kings is mostly negative. Now, you could just read it from just a totally historical viewpoint. This person did this, and then he died, and then this person did this, and it can seem kind of neutral. But when you look at it from a Christian perspective, it can seem like, why is this book in the Bible? It doesn't seem like there are many positive examples in here. There are a few, but you can wonder, why is all this negativity in the Bible? So here's the context. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, what we call 1st and 2nd Kings, used to be one book. So it used to be one unified whole. It starts with Solomon, and it ends with Judah being conquered and going into exile. So remember, the kings of Israel, there was Saul, he was the very first one, and then David, and then Solomon, and then after Solomon, there was a civil war. So Solomon's son Rehoboam became king, but then the northern tribes didn't like Rehoboam, so they split off and they formed their own country, and we call that country Israel. And then the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, they formed their own country too. So there was a civil war, and so it starts with Solomon and some of the things he did, and we looked at that a couple of weeks ago. But then there's a civil war. They split into two nations, and then they both. The northern nation gets taken into captivity sometime in the 700s, and the southern nation gets taken into captivity sometime in the 500s. So it ends with all of God's people, Israel and Judah, being taken into captivity. One Bible scholar counted up all of the kings in the northern kingdom and all of the kings in the southern kingdom, and there were 20 in each. And the kings in the northern kingdom, all of them were bad. There wasn't a single one in the north that was a good, God-honoring king. And then in the south, 8 out of 20 were good, but then 12 out of 20 were bad. So if you gave a grade to Judah, it would be like a C minus, and if you gave a grade to Israel, it would be an F. And so that's what the books of 1st and 2nd Kings record, is all of the wrong choices that Solomon made and Rehoboam, and then all the kings that followed them, just almost one right after another, making foolish choices, leading God's people astray. And so it can seem like when you're reading these passages, and so I want to tell you this just so when you get to 2 Kings or passages like this in your Bible reading, that it can seem like God may not care whether you're strong in your faith or not, because both nations got taken into captivity. All of God's people experienced the same punishment, and so it can seem kind of discouraging. But I want to hopefully show you a little bit why it's in the Bible. Let me give you an example about how you can read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and think God just is ignoring all this injustice that's going on. God doesn't care about all these people who are evil. So there's a king named Ahab, and you've probably heard that name before. Ahab, even when you say that name, even if you don't know a whole lot about the Bible, we still think of Ahab as like one of the most evil people imaginable, one of the most evil kings. Here's an example of something that he did. There was a guy named Naboth, and Naboth had a piece of land that had a vineyard on there. Well, Ahab decided he wanted that land. Just, because he's king, he can just have whatever he wants. So he asks Naboth to sell him or give him that land. Naboth says, no, it's been in my family for all these generations. I like to keep the land. Well, Ahab kills him. He kills Naboth and takes the land, and God doesn't do anything to stop him. So it seems like Naboth is, just being a decent guy. Ahab's this evil guy, and God doesn't stop Ahab from killing Naboth. And so there's this terrible injustice. And not only that, but Ahab's wife, Jezebel, she encourages him to do this. She says, well, just kill him and you can take it. So it can seem like God doesn't care about evil and injustice in the world. Olivia mentioned this guy that was killed. Things like that happen, and it can seem like, God, why don't you stop things like that from happening? Why is there all this evil and this injustice in the world? And so, it can seem like doing the right thing that God doesn't notice or pay attention. If I asked you to name 5 people in your school who you know are strong Christians. They're strong in their faith. They go against the flow. Whenever there's something wrong taking place, they speak up. They're not afraid to stick out. They're very strong and not belligerent and not ugly, but they're just very strong in their faith. They sort of, like I said, they kind of stick out because there's not many people like that. If I were to ask you to name 5 people in your school who you would say, these people are super strong in their faith. I'm not going to ask you, I don't know, but my guess would be you'd probably have, it's not like there would be 5 people right off the top of your head that you could think of. Now, you could probably think of 60 or 70 or more than that who they go to church. And they go to church because either they've mentioned something about it or you've seen pictures on Instagram of them at a church activity. You could probably name a lot of people who are involved in or affiliated with a church in some way. But I just wonder how hard it would be for you to think of 5 people who are very strong in their faith. And that can be discouraging to not be able to think of someone or even 5 people who are really strong in their faith. And so it can seem to you like it probably seemed to the Israelites back then that, okay, you have maybe 1 or 2 people who are really vocal and strong in their faith, strong, outspoken Christians, and then you have just sort of the average person, and both of those people can be good athletes. Both of those people can make good grades and get awards for their grades and scholarships. Both of those people can get into a good college. Both of those people can get a decent job, have a decent family. And so it can look like there's nothing really different about those people's lives. It can look like this person is not really any better off for being strong in their faith than this other person. And that can be discouraging. Now, you do have to remember that the people that you know really well, that's a very small slice of the population. But it can probably be hard for you to think about 5 people in your school who are strong in their faith. So I want to give you a couple of things from the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and hopefully these will be an encouragement to you, because just like there was a lot of negative things going on back during the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, you can sort of feel like you're in a similar situation where you are a follower of Jesus, but there's just so much negative going on. There's so much evil in the world. There's political fighting just all the time, just fighting and bickering, and, police brutality, and just all kinds of things going on. And you can think, man, does God even know? Does God even care about these things that are going on? So I want to encourage you with a couple things from this book. One person is a man named Elijah. Now, Elijah was one of those people who was very strong in his faith, at least for the most part. Elijah was a prophet. He was very vocal about his faith. He was he was not afraid at all to call people out for doing evil things. Like, he called some very powerful people out for the evil things they were doing, like Jezebel. He did a lot of miraculous signs. Like, he was someone who, if you lived in the nation of Israel at that time, and you said, who's someone who's very strong in their faith, Elijah would definitely be that person. But there was a point in Elijah's life where he got very discouraged, like very depressed, thinking that he was the only one in the whole nation who was following God. And so there's this one point where he just goes off by himself like a hermit and lives in a cave or lives in the wilderness somewhere, and he just cries out to God, God, I'm the only one left. Like, I'm the only one living for you in this whole entire nation, so why don't you just kill me right now? I mean, this very person who's very strong in his faith got to a very, very low point. And God's response to Elijah was, listen, I have 7,000 more people in this country who are strong in their faith. 7,000 other people who, in the words of the Bible, have not bowed their knees to Baal. In other words, they have not given in to this culture of idolatry. There's 7,000 more people. Now, Elijah thought he was the only one. And it can feel like to you that you're either the only one that you know who's strong in their faith, or it's a very, very small group of people. But just because you don't know those people doesn't mean that they don't exist. Elijah didn't know that these people existed, but God wanted to encourage him and say, listen, Elijah, I have 7,000 other people in this country who want to worship me, who are strong in their faith. And so I guess one encouragement from this is, first of all, to not think that you're the only one and that God doesn't care and that God doesn't see all the injustice and that God doesn't pay attention to how you're trying to live your life right and follow him, because there are other people around you. But also an encouragement to attach yourself to those people, to try to find a way to be around people who are strong in their faith. So look for a group of people. Look for, like, FCA or Teens for Christ, or a group of people who maybe they pray at lunchtime, or, just look for someone who is strong in their faith. Look for a group of people who are strong in their faith and let yourself be encouraged by that. And don't think that God doesn't care, that God doesn't pay attention. And also remember, I said this a minute ago, but, the people who the people who you know really well are a very, very small part of the population. Like, you probably don't know many people within 5 years outside of your age. You probably don't know a whole lot of people outside that age range. You probably don't know a ton of people from Broome or Landrum or Spartanburg Christian or Southside or Bob Jones Academy or the homeschooling people that are in this city. You probably don't know a whole lot. Just because you don't know people who are strong in their faith doesn't mean they don't exist. So let that be an encouragement to you that God does know, God does pay attention, and it can seem like your life is about the same as everybody else's, but that's not true. We have a very short range of vision whenever it comes to what it feels like God should do in response to the way I'm living. So be encouraged by that there are other people who are strong in their faith, and don't let the fact that you're in the minority discourage you. Secondly, there's a verse in 2 Kings where it seems like everything is going wrong again. There's one evil king, he dies, and he's followed by another evil king, and he dies, and he's followed by another evil king. And every once in a while, like once every 4 kings, it seems like there's someone who is decent, someone who wants to honor God, but it seems like for the most part, things are going downhill. And they are, because at the end of the book, all of God's people are in exile. And so in the middle of that, when it seemed like God didn't care, God wasn't paying attention, there's this verse in 2 Kings 26, and God says this: I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. And the reason why that verse sticks out in that book is that God had been making promises to his people for hundreds of years. God made a covenant with Abraham that he was going to make his descendants into a great nation. He renewed the covenant with Moses. He made a promise to David that, David, there will never be a time when a descendant of yours is not on the throne. And so God made all these promises all along to his people, but it seems like in 2 Kings, God's just letting things go and doesn't care how things turn out. But he says, I will defend this city for the sake of my name, for my sake, and for the sake of my servant David. In other words, the promise that he had made to David. And so all through this time, even during the bad times, God was keeping his promise. Now, I want you to think about that, and I want you to think of, what are some promises that God has made to you? What are some of the promises that God has made to us as his people? Just think of a promise from Scripture that, something positive that God has made to us.
I will be with you always to the very end of the age.
Okay, I will be with you always into the Great Commission. What's another promise that God has made to us as his people?
Like just his followers or everyone?
Just his followers.
I will not let anyone snatch you out of my hand.
Okay, all right. That our relationship with him is secure. No one will snatch you out of my hand. What else? What's another promise that God has made to his people? So God has made us, and just like God 2,500 years ago, during this time, was keeping his promises to his people, God keeps his promises to you today. Promises like, I will never leave you. Jesus said that at the end of the Great Commission. Remember, I will be with you always, even till the end of the age. For those who love God, Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good. All things. He causes all things to work together for good. You're in my Father's hand, like Grace said, and no one will snatch you out of my Father's hand. And just like God was a promise-keeping God 2,500 years ago, God keeps his promises to you today. And it can seem like that God has forgotten, but God hasn't. God sees and God knows everything that's going on. So I just want those things to be an encouragement to you, that it might seem like you are in the vast minority, that there's, it just seems like you might not even know anybody else who's strong in their faith. But there are people, and be encouraged by that you're not the only one who's trying to please God, and God will keep his promises. Now, you might have to suffer as a Christian. And the people in Judah and Israel, the 7,000 in Israel who did love God, who did want to honor God, they got taken into exile just the same as all the evil people got taken into exile. They suffered the same consequences. So sometimes you will have to suffer the consequences of other people's sin. That doesn't mean that just because God keeps his promises that he protects you from all kinds of evil things happening. But God does know. He does see. Don't ever think that he has forgotten you, or that he's not paying attention, or that it doesn't matter whether you live for him or not, because it does. So remember that whenever you read books like 2 Kings, where it just seems so depressing, just one bad thing after another. Those things are in the Bible for a reason. And in a weird kind of way, they're there to encourage us to be strong in our faith, and to learn from people's mistakes.